Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about how censorship is just as much about calling your opponent's speech and the opponents themselves unclean as it is about stopping the supposed misinformation that they're saying. Before we get into it today, I wanted to give you a little bit of an update. I've been a little bit slow to update you on the fact that our case against the federal government for censorship was dismissed on the same week that Justin Hart's case against Facebook was dismissed. Donald Trump's case against Twitter was dismissed. All of these happened on 2 days, even though they had all begun these cases with huge variability in timing. And Alex Berenson's half of his case was also dismissed within several days of ours. We will be appealing. There's 3 or 4 strands going forward in terms of our suit, and I don't know all the details in terms of the other 3, what's going on. And I will update you when I'm able and allowed to update you on what's going on with those. Now, I wanted to, we've talked before, one of my most important, I think, videos in regards to COVID and connecting up COVID hysteria, collective hysteria, to the kinds of beliefs that people got during COVID hysteria, and which is still happening in large parts of the world. And the suite of beliefs, crazy beliefs one had, were actually the kinds of things that you can predict on the basis of our instincts towards contaminants. You can see this in Science Moment 128, where I talk about how our instincts towards cooties, towards contaminants, drives all of these beliefs about COVID. And unfortunately, COVID doesn't have the physics of cooties. Cooties is sort of more by touch and pussy and gross kinds of things. And then also that same video and Substack associated with it is able to explain the treatment of outgroups more generally. It connects up to how these things culturally evolve, and you end up with these kinds of beliefs towards outgroups. And this is just sort of a special case concerning COVID. And one of the rules, there were these sort of Cootie's laws, and Cootie's law number 3 was you can't clean contaminated things. Once dirty or unclean, gets pus on it, it always is dirty. And once one gets unclean, you're sort of treated as always potentially unclean. And this is true not just for sort of real infectious biological things, but also about outgroups. So if someone who's in some of the unclean outgroup, whether it's the unvaccinated or whether it's COVID deniers, or whether it's homosexuality, or whether it's the wrong religion, or whatever the outgroup is, once you're in that group or you associate with people in that group, it can spread and it can permanently contaminate you. And this was part of why people ended up believing that COVID cannot be treated. Early treatment is not even a possibility. Shouldn't even be, anybody should be fired from their medical positions if they propose it or are proponents of it. And recovery from COVID cannot possibly give you natural immunity, because that would violate this intuition people instinctually have. Now, I wanted to bring this up in a slightly different context, and that's concerning censorship. A lot of what goes on in censorship is, of course, trying to stop your opponent's beliefs, and they often believe that stopping those beliefs is actually beneficial to everybody because those beliefs are harmful and they have these sorts of... But part of it is also because those people saying those things that are against the mainstream narrative are unclean, then their speech is unclean, and these kinds of processes, even though no one may be intentfully doing it like this, although some are, the idea is to paint one's speech and paint one's enemy's speech and one's enemies themselves as unclean. And if you think that this metaphor is a little bit too far, I'll give you an example in my case, in the case of Twitter's censorship of me. As I've talked to you before, I've been suspended a couple times, permanently suspended back in December of 2021. I appealed a couple weeks later, did get back in, but I've shown you before that there's the curve of my impressions from the beginning of COVID all the way up until May of 2021, a little bit more than a year later, rose and rose and rose, and just had more and more impressions. But then suddenly, the Biden administration had decided to double down, triple down, quadruple down, and work with big tech to censor misinformation, and my impressions fell all the way down to where it was before. And this is also true about my new number of new subscribers per month at YouTube. These big tech was clearly coordinating with one another and with the federal government to stop unclean speech. And again, let me give you an example of the sense in which it's unclean. There's many ways that you could decide to deboost somebody, many different kinds of mechanisms, but one of the multiple ways, more salient ways that Twitter decided to deboost me, and I didn't realize this, they never told me, they just secretly labeled me as having sensitive content. My site, if you go to find Mark Changizi, if you can find me at all, and I've talked before, I was just so deboosted you couldn't even find me. Even if you type the last I don't come, Mark Changizi, last I still don't come up unless you hit click more, and then eventually you can see mine, and then it says, this is a sensitive account. All of my tweets are labeled, this is sensitive, this is sensitive. In order to see it, you've got to do A, B, C, D, and most people don't know how to even figure out how to do this, so they just see sensitive content. Now, when do normal people outside of socio-political situations use the term sensitive content? You can label yourself as sensitive content. That's my setting on sensitive content is clicked to sensitive, but I can't unclick it. It's just, they did it, and it's showing that it's sensitive, but I have no ability to undo it. Who does put themselves as sensitive content? Well, unbeknownst to me, I just learned this last year, there's genuine real live porn. There's genuine real live hardcore stuff on Twitter. I didn't realize that. I thought it was like Facebook and Instagram, where there's sort of a rule. You can't show certain. You can't be fully nude. There's sometimes tasteful ones from some angles, and then they put a shadow. No, it turns out Twitter is like full on porn on there apparently, and the trick is you just say, okay, I'm sensitive content, and so then you can engage in all these other kinds of behaviors on Twitter and get away with it, which is fine with me. But notice that me, someone who's a supposedly misinformer, the label that they decided to label me, rather than saying this is misinformation, this site is a misinformation site, they call me sensitive content, which is basically to say I'm the equivalent of all of these sorts of gross things that pornography is associated with. I'm not saying it should be, I'm just saying it, in fact, it is associated with. The kind of uncleanliness associated with pornography, which is of course also associated with infectiousness, because those sorts of behaviors are being a whore, they're all associated with all the infectiousness that comes with that. That's all wrapped up together. So I'm labeled as sensitive because of my anti-mainstream narrative views, which is just to call me a whore or a porn kind of person, right? So in fact, here's what they wrote to me after all this time, them never telling me that I was labeled such. They go, thanks for reaching out to us about the issue you're having with your content being labeled as sensitive on Twitter. We understand how important it is to have full control over your tweets on the platform. No worries, we have more information for you. After investigating, we saw that your account has been marked as media contains sensitive content by Twitter. We're sorry to say that once an account has been marked by Twitter, it's permanent. Once contaminated, always contaminated. And again, this is exactly fitting the Cooties rule number 3 from Science Moment 128. I recommend that you go see this. I kept going back and forth with them. Thanks for reaching out back to us. We understand. We're still looking into ways of appealing it, but they're basically just giving me the push off. So here we have a situation where even at the most formal levels, I'm being treated as permanently unclean and infectious, even within their own formal mechanisms, fitting exactly what you'd expect. So I encourage you to go back, see moment number 128, try to wrap your head around the extent to which you yourself sometimes treat others as unclean, as infectious, that are in outgroups, so that you can be more aware of these kinds of human instincts so that we can together overcome them. And that was your Science Moment.